I'm back here with part 2. I don't usually do two parts. Usually I figure 30 minutes is enough. Just stop wherever you're at 30 minutes and don't keep talking. But I spent the whole time on the previous one talking about the source material. I didn't even get around to this book. So I'm going to indulge myself and do a follow-up and try and talk about the actual book this time. Which means I'm going to try not to get off on any tangents this time about the source material. Other than to quickly kind of maybe summarize from the previous video and maybe make explicit how this feeds into it. The problems with the source material are kind of twofold. The narration is very limited, very bare bones. It doesn't really explain anything that's going on. Some of these bizarre stories don't get an explanation. And the early King David stories are very repetitive. Everything kind of happens twice. I have believed for some time that there is an epic story trapped inside the Bible kind of narrative. If there's an author who can kind of dig it out, smooth over all these kind of repetitions, kind of actually explain what's going on. And I think you have a story there which kind of could be Shakespearean, could kind of equal the Greek tragedies, could maybe kind of equal the Greek epics. Except it's a very brutal story, and that's going to be another problem for the modern reader. And that's a problem that manifests itself in this book. But we'll get into that. This book is told from the standpoint of the prophet Nathan. It jumps around in time a lot, and if you're familiar with the Old Testament stories, these jumping around in time is not a problem for you because you already know the internal chronology of the story. If you're not familiar with the story, I imagine it could be a problem. But I don't know, because I'm familiar with these stories. So I didn't have a problem with it. I'd be interested in the perspective of somebody who came into these stories kind of not knowing their Bible quite so well. Because it starts off with kind of, these jumps in chronology can get very confusing. Have the potential to be very confusing. It starts off with Nathan at the end of his life, kind of under King Solomon, kind of, I'm not even really sure what's going on in this brief prologue. He's just kind of, oh, here is me at the end of my life, old and weak. Then it jumps back to when David is king and Nathan's getting called before David. It turns out David has just been kind of forbidden from going out with his army on campaign. So his army is going off to war for the first time without David, and David is left in the palace fuming about how dare they leave me behind. And then we have a flashback to kind of the reason why David is being left behind. So there's a battle with the Philistines. David almost gets killed by a spear, and then Abishai, who's the brother of Joab, kind of runs and jumps and deflects a spear at the last moment. And then that's the reason the men decide, okay, it's too dangerous to have the king kind of go with us in battle anymore. The king has to leave behind, and David is kind of furious about this. Now, I didn't, as somebody who claims to know these stories well, I have to admit I didn't even recognize this story. But, you go on Wikipedia, and sure enough, this story, or at least the bones of it, comes straight out of 2 Samuel. I forget where, 16, maybe 15, I forget. David's fighting against the Philistines, and it just, that classic biblical narrative where it just kind of very briefly mentions what happens and doesn't really give you any of the details. It says they fought against the Philistines. There was a giant who almost killed King David, but Abishai slew the giant and saved King David, and then the men decided King David couldn't go out and fight with them anymore. And then it goes right on to the next story, the next campaign. And you think, boy, there's an epic story in there somewhere, but the biblical narrator has not brought it out. And someone like Homer would have made a real meal of that story. And it's interesting, Homer a lot of this is based on supposition about where you kind of place the dates for the King David narrative and where you place the dates for Homer. If you take the view that the King David narrative is based on an authentic court history that could have been contemporary with David, and it might have been, as I mentioned in the previous video, there are some historians who think this, and that Homer was writing around 700 BC or whatever, then Homer and the King David narrative could have been rough contemporaries, maybe. But like Homer would never have done that. You know, like in Homer, you would have had the epic battle, you would have had the names of everyone David was killing, you would have known who their fathers were. Then when the giant came in, he would have made a speech to King David, and then King David would have made a speech back, and then Abishai, like, you would have had you would have had the blow by blow of the battle, who threw their spear first, who, where the javelin went. Like, Homer would have made a real meal of that story. The biblical narrator does not. And so that's why we don't... I think you have the framework of an epic in the King David story, but it's not drawn out. Here, it gets drawn out. She goes through the battle. She describes how Abishai saves David's life. And she also describes the emotions. Now, the emotions are not in the Bible story, so they have to be inferred. But, if you're making a story out of this and fleshing it out, that's what you have to do. So King David is really furious. He wanted to kill Abishai. And Abishai, did I mention this before? Terrible at this. He's the younger brother of Joab. There are 3 sons of David's sister who are kind of in his army. Joab is one of them. Abishai is another one. The other one got killed fighting Abner kind of earlier. David is so angry at Abishai for saving his life that he wanted to kill him there on the spot. He couldn't do it, of course, because he didn't have a reason, but he was so mad that Abishai had made him look weak. He's furious about kind of being left behind where the army goes on campaign without him. And so I think that's the kind of work that needs to be done by a novelist to kind of flesh the story out and make it a real story and kind of rescue it from the Bible narrative where it is. And there are countless other examples of this, kind of all the way through, almost all the way through. So there are a few stories that she omits. Like I mentioned in the first video, the story about how kind of David counted all the men in his army and got God really mad at him. That story gets omitted. But and the repetitions, like a lot of the stuff happens twice in the 1 Samuel. She takes out a lot of those repetitions, like not King David. He's not king at this stage, he's an outlaw, but outlaw David spares Saul's life only once in this book. In the Bible it happens twice because kind of everything happens twice for some reason in the early King David stories. So she leaves out a few things and she omits the repetition, but other than that, it's a fairly faithful accounting of 1 and 2 Samuel, where she is taking these texts where there's not much of a story and she's making a story out of it. There are numerous examples. The other most obvious one is the capture of Jerusalem. Now, the Jerusalem is one of these inconsistencies in the Bible. I think in the book of Joshua, it's supposed to be captured, if I'm remembering right. But then when we get to Samuel, it's not captured. All of a sudden, there are Jebusites in it, which is odd because it's kind of right in the middle of Israel. But she explains this in the book. She explains, gives it a backstory. Why are the Jebusites still kind of in this Jerusalem, even though the Israelites are controlling everything else? So yeah, that's one example. And then the other example, in the Bible, the Jebusites say to David, "You'll never conquer the city." And then it says in 1 Samuel, but David conquered it. And David said, well, everyone always said if you're going to conquer Jerusalem, you have to go through the water shaft. And that's it. So it's implied that David conquered Jerusalem by somehow going through the water shaft there, because he said afterwards, that was how you had to conquer Jerusalem. But like, it's never explained at all. Like, what's going on with this water shaft? There's some sort of water shaft going into Jerusalem. Where is it? How does it work? How do David's men get into it? Why isn't it guarded? How does David even know about it? Like, how does he get this information? All this kind of stuff, which is just not there in the biblical text at all. But if you're going to make a story out of it, you've got to kind of invent these details. And she does, and she makes a great story out of it. This whole kind of section about the conquest of Jerusalem, going through the water shaft, the water pipes into the city. It wasn't pipes, it was a shaft. But I mentioned in the previous video when Joab killed Amasa. Happens out of nowhere in 2 Samuel, although you can kind of make guesses as to why he did it, because like Amasa has kind of been placed by David in Joab's old job. But all the reasons are here in this book. Now, the big problem, at least for me, and maybe this is a personal thing, is the original King David story is very brutal. Now, I don't mean to pick on the Bible too much, because kind of all of these old Iron Age stories are very brutal. Like the Iliad is very brutal. But the Bible is very brutal as well. And if you're making a modern story for a modern audience, it can be maybe a problem to bring the modern audience along with you on this ride. I think that's a challenge when you're kind of tackling these old stories. The part where it's most noticeable, there is a part in the King David story, or when the David story, he's not king at this point yet, where he's hiding out in Philistine territory. Now, the Philistines have always been the enemies of Israel, kind of all throughout the biblical narrative. But there's this bizarre part in the David story when he actually goes over to the Philistines. Actually, it happens twice. Everything happens twice in 1 Samuel. But Geraldine Brooks smooths it out, so she omits kind of the first time it happened, and it's only recounting the one time it happened. He goes over to the Philistines, and he's living with their king under their protection. And the Philistine king kind of sends David out on these raids on Israel. So he's supposed to be raiding his own people. David doesn't want to raid his own people, so he raids the Amalekite villages around Philistine and brings that back and kind of pretends that he's been raiding the Israelites. Of course, in order to get away with this subterfuge, he needs to make sure there are no survivors of the villages that he raids. So not only do they raid, they go in and massacre everyone. They kill all the villagers. And this is right there in the Bible. And typical biblical narrative, it's just kind of recounted without kind of any gloss, just kind of very bare bones narration. Now, throughout the Old Testament, the Amalekites, God really hates the Amalekites, because the Amalekites attacked the Israelites when they were coming out of Egypt once. And so God commands numerous times that all the Amalekites have to be wiped out. In fact, this is one of the reasons that Saul loses God's favor. Although, again, everything happens twice in this narrative. Saul loses God's favor twice, but for at least one of those reasons, it's because he didn't wipe out the Amalekites completely. So maybe David is just kind of following God's commandments, although it's not clear in the Bible text. It looks like this is not, even though God did command them to wipe out the Amalekites, what David is doing in this particular instance is just kind of killing them to cover up his raids. In fact, it says in the Bible, like he was killing them so that no survivors could report back to the Philistine king. So he wasn't killing them because of the biblical commandment, although that commandment existed. The morality gets a little bit confusing in the Bible, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And it's never commented in the Bible, like, was God happy with this, angry with this, just kind of let it go. Like like I said in the previous video, that God kind of is in the background for parts of the David narrative. But anyways, it's in this book. And to her credit, Geraldine Brooks had a choice to make. You know, do you omit this part or do you put this part in the book? And I think it would have been dishonest to omit it. It would have been whitewashing the Bible. So she made the right choice to put it in it, to put this in. But she doesn't flinch. She describes it. She describes the prophet Nathan, who's the narrator of this book, and he sees a woman and her child, and he doesn't want to kill them, and then David goes in to kill them, and Nathan says, no, don't, what are you doing? And David just kind of looks at him shocked. He says, oh, you know what we have to do, right? This is what we do. We kill everyone. And then David goes and he kills the mother and the child, and then, you know, Nathan feels really sad, and well, Nathan's feeling sad. King David's men kill everyone in the village. And this is not something that happened one time, although it's only described in detail one time, but this is something that happened numerous times where David was living under the protection of the Philistines. Now, maybe you could get away with that in the Iron Age, but you can't. From a storytelling perspective, it's very hard to get away with that in the modern age, even though that's true to the source material. And I'm not saying she should have left it out. If she would have left it out, it would have been whitewashing. But then once you have that, then how can you sympathize with King David ever again? I think, like in the Iron Age, you could say, oh, he was a great poet, and he wrote some beautiful songs, and he had a great heart, and he also massacred some villages when he was younger. But like, you can't do that in the modern age. You can't say, oh, he was such a great guy, and by the way, he massacred some villages. Like, once you talk about him massacring villages, like, it's done. Like, I don't even want to hear about what a great poet he is. Like, don't tell me about how his hair was flowing in nice locks, or how he had such a beautiful, handsome face, or how women loved him, or all this other details she goes into about whether David, you know, what a great guy David was. I think, you know, the way they always say this to kind of justify this is, oh, he was a complicated person. Yeah, you know, what a complicated historical figure is how people always talk about King David. Like, I don't want to hear about how he was complicated. Like, you tell me he massacred the people, these women and children. I don't even care about the rest of it. You know, like, apparently, I'm told Pol Pot was really interested in poetry. Stalin, I read a biography of him some years ago, and he tried his hand at poetry, wrote some poetry that was good. I don't know, wrote some poetry at least. It's once you talk about the massacre in villages, the fact that they wrote beautiful poetry is just a minor detail. And so, throughout the rest of the section, when you're reading about King David escaping from Saul, or how heartbroken David is when he hears that Prince Jonathan has died, I thought, I don't care. You know, guy massacred villages. I don't care how sad he is when Jonathan dies. Or, you know, he wrote this beautiful song. I don't care about the beautiful song. And so it's a problem. And, you know, the thing is, like, I knew this before, having read these Bible stories, but I guess this is where the distance of the biblical narrator is actually an attribute, because it allows you to just say, oh yeah, okay, and he massacred some villages here, and you don't have to see it in detail. Once you see it in detail, I think that the reader is just done. No sympathy left for King David. But, you know, what was she going to do? You can't leave that stuff out. So I was kind of repulsed by this figure kind of throughout the rest of the story, and I was repulsed all the more whenever he was described in sympathetic terms, or when the first person narrator, Nathan, was kind of talking about, like, his beautiful hair or something. I could not care less about his beautiful hair after that. Now, I think Geraldine Brooks maybe has anticipated this, and that's why she made Nathan the focal point of the story. So everything is kind of being viewed through Nathan's eyes. So even though King David is a complicated figure, we have the prophet Nathan, who the reader can kind of completely identify with. The problem with that, though, is Nathan is such a sycophant to King David. Like he tells King David kind of the harsh truths, but he's obviously very enamored with David, even though he occasionally will speak back to David. So that just made it worse for me. But the story, at least my interest in the story, picked up again once we get to the succession narrative. So the succession narrative in the Bible, it's most of 2 Samuel and even a little bit the chapters of 1 and 2 Kings, where it's describing kind of all the infighting at David's court. So David's sons are fighting with each other. David has generals who are also his nephews, Joab and Abishai and Asahel, who he can't control. David is trying to bring in people from Saul's court, Abner and Ishbosheth, and what's the name, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. But this is kind of causing conflict in his court. Joab kills Abner, and then his sons start killing each other, and his nephews, Joab is killing his sons. And this is complicated enough, and there's enough drama here, that I was kind of drawn back into the story at this point. Even though all of these people are utterly despicable, there's drama in this. And I think it's like that HBO series, The Sopranos, or Breaking Bad, or kind of a lot of modern television nowadays, where even though you know all these characters are not good people, there's enough drama in here and kind of plots and intrigue that you're kind of drawn into the intrigue. And I was here during the succession narrative. I also kind of had the advantage, knowing these Bible stories, of kind of knowing what was coming, which when I read historical fiction, and I'm going to count this as historical fiction, even though I know the debate about its historicity. I figure if it's in debate, it's close enough. I'm calling it historical fiction. If you don't know the story, if you don't know the history, then historical fiction is a very pleasant way to learn it. But if you're a history nerd like I am, even if you know the history, historical fiction is fun to read because you say, okay, I know what's coming. How is the author going to explain this? Or I know this character does this despicable thing later on in the story. How are they going to set it up? How are they going to, explain it away if it's a sympathetic character, or how are they going to tell the story? And so, kind of with Absalom and Amnon, two of David's sons who kind of hated each other, you can kind of see this getting set up early in the story. You know what's going to happen with the rape of Tamar, Absalom's sister, and then it happens, and then knowing the story did not spoil it for me. There were also details that I had forgotten. And some of these things, it's interesting, you read this kind of with the Bible kind of side by side maybe. Some of these things I had forgotten were in the Bible, and I thought, oh, this must just be a narrative flourish here. And then you kind of go to the Bible, and oh, right. Detail was actually in the Bible. Like when, for example, after Absalom killed Amnon, he was banished by David. And then Joab actually was a guy who kind of contrived to get Absalom invited back. And Joab had this woman plead with David, and David said, wait. Who put you up to this? It was Joab, wasn't it? And she said, okay, yeah, Joab did it. And I thought, okay, that's just her invention. And then you go in the Bible, and sure enough, but actually I had forgotten that story. Joab did put the old woman up to it. Joab wanted Absalom back in David's court for reasons which are typically not explained in the Bible, but she explains this she explains it in her book and gives it a backstory. I think, what was the story again? Joab was worried about King David, and he thought kind of bringing Absalom back would kind of make King David happy. Of course, then Joab is the one who kills Absalom later, right? Because King David says, whatever you do, nobody kill Absalom. And it was Joab who kills him. So, like, why did Joab plead for Absalom to come back and then later kill him? Well, again, the biblical narrator doesn't say, but she's able to kind of weave a story out of it, and Joab is just kind of furious that Absalom has kind of made him look foolish after Joab kind of put his neck out on the line for Absalom. And so that's why he killed him. So I think this is a very good attempt to take the source material and to make a real story out of it. I'm not is it the best that could be done? I don't know. Be interesting for someone to come along later and kind of try their hand at it. I was looking this up at Wikipedia. There have been a handful of books that have tried to make novels out of the King David story. Going back, obviously, as they would, because we've had this story for like 3,000 years now. Kind of going all the way back to medieval times, some of them, and a handful of books that Wikipedia lists in the 20th century. It's almost surprising me that there aren't more novelists who have tried to kind of rescue the bones of the story from the Bible. But I think, like, being in the Bible is a double-edged sword. Like, on one hand, everybody knows the story because everyone learns it at Sunday school. So by virtue of being in the Bible, the King David story has become like one of the most famous stories in the world. And this, I think, even nowadays, most people know it. Certainly 100 years ago, when biblical literacy was more of a thing, everybody knew the story. But that same preservation in the Bible, which has caused everyone to know the story, has made everyone afraid to play with it, because that's a sacred text, so you can't change the details of it. I suspect that if King David had not been part of the Bible, it would have gone the route of King Arthur. King Arthur was for, I think, centuries in the French literary tradition. It was actually the French authors who made most of the legend of King Arthur, ironically enough. The French authors just kind of kept rewriting it, and each author would kind of go back to the one before and kind of make the details kind of more complicated and the characters more complex. I think maybe that could have happened to the King David story if it hadn't been a part of sacred text. But because there's enough hints of a really good story in there that somebody could draw the drama out of it. Because it's been part of the sacred text, people have been afraid to play with it, I think, until kind of now when we're entering a more secular age. And one of the things that she's playing with here, for example, is making the relationship between David and Jonathan explicitly homosexual. It was not explicitly homosexual in the Bible, although people debate whether it was intended to be read as homosexual or not. So some of the things she brings out in this book, like David mentions a number of times that he preferred Jonathan's love to the love of woman. And she mentions it a number of times, and then you go back to the Bible, and sure enough, right there in the Bible, David said, I love his love more than the love of woman. So is that kind of homosexual, or is that just kind of like the ancient ideal that the platonic love between two men is kind of the highest love because women aren't capable of forming those kind of higher relationships, which I think was also an ancient ideal. But you certainly could read it in